this month we got the lovely and talented Ken Moore to give us a nice little talk about Lumina and desktop PSD experiences. So.
Thank you.
Take it away.
Now, in all due fairness, I did give this talk at Ohio Linux Fest. Was it 2 months ago now, JT?
No, like a month ago.
Yeah, it only was.
It was last month.
So, but this was a kind of a new talk for me because, well, I try to write new talks for almost everything, but this one's very interesting because it goes into a lot of like the fundamental assumptions of how you develop things and how things have grown over time. So, if things start to get too technical or I start talking too deep, by all means, raise your hand and say, what? And I will tone it down. Oh, I'll talk about Lumina 2, that's in here.
In 2 weeks.
So just giving you a heads up, I'm very relaxed. By all means, ask questions, heckle, snide remarks, they're all welcome. Perfectly fine. Alright. So today there's really four big questions that I want to talk about. Alright. First, what is a desktop? It's always nice to define our terms first. 2, how is a desktop assembled? How does a desktop integrate with the underlying operating system? And how is Lumina 2 any different? Because I am the author of the Lumina desktop, so I have to talk about that too. So first off, what's a desktop? You go to any conference, you ask 3 different people, you'll get 3 completely different answers. Alright, so this is probably one of the most common answers that I've ever heard, but summarized a little bit. Basically a complete graphical system with a collection of all sorts of utilities for all of your common utilities. So that would be something like KDE or GNOME or XFCE. They would fit into this umbrella. You install KDE and that's it. You don't need anything else. It comes with a web browser. It comes with an email client. It comes with an Office suite. It comes with whatever you might need. You don't need anything else. Typically, this provides an interface with application shortcuts. The second answer that people will give is only the interface. So something that provides application shortcuts, something that manages your graphical windows. Some desktops that you may have heard of that fall under this category would be something like KDE's Plasma. Not all of KDE, but specifically Plasma or Plasma 5. That would fall more into this because it's just the desktop interface. It's not all the other utilities. Lumina 1.0 falls under this, and then a lot of people build their own under this. They take some kind of window manager like OpenBox or i3WM and they add a dock and then they add some other kind of application management and they make a desktop of their own. And then the third answer that a lot of people will say is like, well, it's just the window manager. You just need something to manage Windows. That is the desktop. You don't need anything else. So those are very common answers.
It's a small group. Should we take a poll here of what everyone uses? I'm actually curious to know,
okay, I'm perfectly
go
fine.
around and see what is a preferred desktop to everyone.
All right, so let's see. Okay, how many people think or use a desktop like number 1?
Let's go around and ask around which one they use.
Let's start.
I'm using either on a Railbox or Solaris box, so that's my.
Okay. Do you know what kind of interface you're using for that?
What Rail uses GNOME, right? Rail uses GNOME.
Okay.
I think that's what Solaris uses too.
Yeah, kind of a version of that.
Yeah, one of the older.
One of the GNOME 2 versions, maybe?
Yeah. What was it again?
What desktop are you using?
No, what was his?
Solaris.
Rail and Solaris.
Well,
No.
yeah.
Yeah, that'd be no.
Okay. What about you, Joe? I know you.
Depends on which week it is. Mostly Lumina, Mate.
Lumina, but I'm very agnostic. I rotated throughout the years and just tweaked a little bit to what I wanted and made sure I could get to my shell, and that was then used. I need a shell and a web browser, so all this is kind of out the window for me.
I understand. What are you, Rod?
Waiting for Lumina 2. Lumina 1.3, 1, whatever. Lumina.
We're on 1.3.3 right now at the unstable, but yeah. I know you're running Lumina. Okay, what about you guys?
Well, depending on the installation, Lumina or Mate.
Lumina and OpenBox.
So I run Lumina, but anything that gets me a VI and a web browser, I'm good.
Again, same idea.
I used a Chromebook for a while. Did it?
I'm new to all this. I use Windows.
That's fine.
When someone tells me about desktop, is literally my desktop.
What's the official term for Windows desktop? Do you remember? No,
Windows
there's
desktop.
there's actually a term for just the desktop
Yeah,
itself.
There's
Explorer.
Arrow is the
Explorer?
compositing manager, and then Explore is the
Explore is
shell.
the process.
Yeah.
Okay.
If you kill Explorer, you kill your desktop.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
You know lots of things on Windows.
Yeah.
You kill your
Yes, that's very true. What about you?
I'm closer to the VI and browser thing. I use Fluxbox.
Yep.
General, it's quick.
Yeah, I understand.
And next month, VI versus Emacs.
Oh man. I use Lumina, and for some of my work I have to use Windows. So but I like to use Lumina.
And I use Lumina at work and Windows at home for gaming.
I feel like we have a biased crowd.
I know, I was going to say, in all fairness though, a lot of the people here work here and we install Lumina on all systems. So they're kind of stuck with that.
Not stuck, just too lazy.
It's not stuck, yeah, too late to go install something else. Alright, so this is what I would propose as probably the best answer after talking to a lot of people and condensing kind of all the reasons for why they pick their answers. I think this was really what it boils down to. A desktop should be a graphical interface to an operating system which supports industry standards for application interaction and controls. That's really what you're getting down to when you're talking about a desktop. It's to provide the standardization framework for interacting with all the other stuff, all your applications. Some examples of standards for window management, you have the ICCCM and then the Extended Window Manager hints. Those are just some of the free desktop standards that are pretty much universally accepted among X11 graphical systems. Application registration, once again, the XDG desktop menu and entry specs are a couple good examples for how to understand and interact with those. Debatable specs are theming specs, how to set your icons, how to set your cursor themes, what about color schemes, things like that. Alright, so those tend to be a little bit more optional, but things like how to talk to a window and tell it to close is pretty well a standard. How to tell, hey, what application is installed and can be run is pretty well a standard. So, let me go back to this. So, taking this definition and looking back again at the desktops that we had mentioned before, KDE and GNOME, obviously, yes, they satisfy this. They're kind of the one-size-fits-all. They do everything, so they do this too. So yes, they're definitely desktops. What about something like, let's take Fluxbox. Would Fluxbox be a desktop under this definition?
It's soft, isn't it?
If you don't count the second one.
Yeah, so Fluxbox does window management. It doesn't do anything with applications. It doesn't have any kind of specifications. The only way to actually launch stuff within Fluxbox is either to hit Alt F2 and type the command yourself from the runner to launch the binary. Not the application name, the binary name. Or you have to go in and edit the menu file and write them in manually yourself, saying that this is the name of my application, this is the binary associated with that, so that it shows up in your context menu. You have to do a lot of stuff yourself. It doesn't do anything for you. So I would say that Fluxbox, and by extension something like OpenBox and a couple others, would not be desktops. They're getting there, but they don't provide enough. They don't provide enough of the standards support. For the applications, they only provide standard support for managing the windows, and that's not enough for to be called a desktop. Another extension is actually, does the desktop manage the wallpaper that's used for your session? Everybody pretty much wants an image for your wallpaper on your screen, right? Fluxbox doesn't. OpenBox, I don't think, does it. Most of the window managers don't. They expect you to run something else to actually change the wallpaper or set the wallpaper for your screen.
But they do, it does apply themes and stuff out of box, I think.
It will apply themes. Most of them have some kind of theming, but usually it's just for themselves. It's not for applications.
Right.
So there is a very distinct difference. Some of them, if they're written well, will have themes for themselves, but not all of them do.
Yep.
So let's just kind of go on. It's like, okay, how was a desktop actually created? When we look at time, as time progressed, when people actually went through and started writing desktops, originally you just had X11. You launched X to run an application, and that was it. You just ran the application. Over time, they're like, oh, wait a minute, we want to run more than one application now. So now we launch X to run something else, and then that runs 1 or 2 or 3 applications, and that's where the concept of window manager came about. You start up the window manager with X, and then that manages other things, your other applications. After that, it's like, okay, now we also need wallpapers, for that, because that's running all the time to launch other stuff. So now we need to start bringing about a bunch of other visual effects into it. And then, okay, what about icons for our applications and stuff like that, things to paint on the wallpaper. And then it's like, oh, well, what if we need to reserve some screen space? That's where you get panels. It's like, okay, I have this bottom area of the screen. My applications don't always fill the screen. I want to keep a little area that's always visible. That's where a panel comes by. Then they added things like screensavers. They added screen lockers. Clipboard management, so that when you copy and paste, it's saved globally. Keychain management. Application launchers. So instead of actually, like Fluxbox, having to run binaries directly, now they added the specifications for finding and actually launching generic applications that might be associated with all sorts of other things. And then it got so big, it's like, okay, now we need a session manager to manage all the stuff just for the session, the desktop itself. And then you can see they started adding all these other things. They started adding file managers into the desktop itself. The service managers, device managers, network managers, file sharing, and there are even a lot of rumblings of package management directly built into the desktop itself. So, I mean, that's just, as time has progressed, more and more and more stuff has kind of been included in this bundle that they call the desktop. All right? And if you start to organize these a little bit, you can start to see a trend. Originally, it was just the desktop session, just enough to manage X. And that was pretty much it. Then they started adding the stuff to, okay, we need to provide the standardization for the applications to talk to us to get things. Talk to the global clipboard, talk to the global keychain. Things to make it easier for applications to use rather than every one of them having to do their own thing. And then down here, they're starting to go more into operating system control systems. It's like, oh, now we tell the operating system where files are, that I want to do something. I want to mount stuff. I want to do, X, Y, Z. That's kind of the trend just in the development of desktops itself and where they've gone and where they're going and how they're adding more and more into it. So, this automatically brings to mind my question. If the desktop is starting to take over a lot of operating system controls, where is the operating system in all of this? And when does the desktop eventually become the operating system or become an integral part of the operating system? That's a very fundamental question, because if it keeps going like this, that line is getting blurred more and more and more. So I would say that this has kind of been the historic delineation of what's different between the operating system and the desktop. The graphical console versus the system console is the best way to think about it. So your system console, you install a server, no graphics, no X. What do you have? You typically have keyboard only. You still have user group management. You still have networking. You still have some basic services, usually related to networking or shared directories and stuff like that. Your file systems are all managed at the operating system level, because that doesn't need any graphics. Your shells, again, because that's your terminal interface to the system. Your hardware drivers, and then they actually provide standard libraries that everything else is supposed to interact with. Usually C libraries. In some cases, like on Windows or whatever, we'll have other types of libraries that everything, including the applications, all will link against and use. What about the desktop? The desktop is kind of analogous to this, only it's graphical instead of terminal. So it's better for alternate types of inputs. Keyboards are no longer required. They are optional if you have a mouse, or you have a touch screen, or you have something else. Graphical is a little bit more flexible with regards to what type of inputs it will accept from the user. They typically go more to multi-user availability for graphical sessions. So normally if the terminal, you log in and that entire terminal is just for you. When you go to graphical systems, you often have a switch user button or something like that that lets you actually operate and run multiple users on the same system on the same session. Not always, but oftentimes. Multi-application. In a terminal, when you type a command, you're running one thing. Unless you run a utility like screen that lets you then split off and run multiple things at once, it's not really designed that. It's designed for one thing at a time, and then you use other stuff to do the multiplexing. Graphical is designed for multiple stuff at once by design. That's kind of the whole point of it. It's a graphical visualization of the operating system rather than a text visualization of the operating system, which is what the terminal is. And then it also provides standard libraries that almost everything uses the graphics. In this case, the X11 or Wayland libraries. There are standard things that everything links against and uses to talk to it. So how does it tie into the desktop system then? If we use those distinctions, where are they starting to blur? Where are they starting to merge together? I call this OS intrusion by the desktop. What about file system interference? Where is the desktop starting to define what the file system can or can't do? GVFS from GNOME. It's a virtual file system over the top of your system-provided operating system. And it will the desktops expect that to be there and talk to that, for GNOME in particular, And if GVFS doesn't support something, they say, oh, well, the user doesn't have access to it at all, even if the underlying operating system file system does. You have to go through a layer to get to it. iNotify is another one. Does it support it or not? Do you get notifications? What about bypassing user restrictions? If you have a server, files and file systems have very clearly locked users and groups and permission sets and stuff. PolicyKit and Dbus are probably the two most widely used services designed more for desktop use to work around the user restrictions so that you can just read stuff as a root service and provide info back to some user, whether that user has permissions to actually change that file or not. What about removable device management? Haldy's one of them that's been around for a while. What about auto mounting and auto run systems? What actually sets that up? Is it the operating system that defines that and does all that, or is it the desktop that does it? And I would argue that it is things like the desktop. It is GNOME, it is KDE, that have their particular services that try to watch for the devices, and they tell the operating system, I need to mount that over here with this format and stuff like that, and the desktop dictates what should happen with those devices rather than the operating system deciding. Yes, Joe?
That's changed a little bit in Linux, I'm pretty sure, because it used to be UDEV. It
Mhm.
was like our equivalent to dev and then now it's systemd.
Yeah.
So I think it's more back in the kernel now.
They're starting to move stuff back. Systemd
Yeah.
is another ball of wax that I can talk to you a little bit more about later.
I don't know. Just,
All right, but
just
yeah.
throwing it out there.
So this is just kind of the way the desktops have grown and why you can see they started doing these things. And then what about hardware management? UPower and stuff is a good example for that on Linux.
What do you mean by the one above that?
Oh, shared network protocols. On Linux, when you want to access an NFS or Samba share,
Okay.
how do you do it? You have to go through like the Thunar File Manager or Dolphin or something like that. Those are the ones that mount the share. Those are
Essentially-
the ones that provide access to it,
essentially through
not the
GDFS.
operating system.
And
Yeah, I just
So your access, you have to access, your ability to access network shares relies on your desktop, not on your operating system. I think this can all be boiled down to this simple statement I have at the bottom, is that what desktops are doing with all of this is they're trying to enforce some kind of standardized operating system interactions. All the desktops try to do or have access to these functionality in various ways. GNOME and KDE do it by just forcing it themselves and saying, no, you have to install our stuff and our stuff has to run and then it'll work. Things like Lumina say, no, we'll just be more flexible for whatever is on your operating system, but you have to give us, the definitions up front. For FreeBSD, do this. For Linux, do this. Things like that. And essentially it boils down to, we're just trying to find standardized ways of doing all these common tasks. And really what it comes down to is desktops, they really need a standardized operating system API. Just talking to the operating system in a standardized way to say, I need information about this and I need to know I need to ask you to do this. Those are really the two main things. All right. So how is Lumina any different? Any other questions before I go on? No? Okay. So I mentioned Lumina 1 a little bit. Now I'm going to start talking a little bit more about Lumina 1 versus Lumina 2 and how it ties in with all the other desktops and how they all relate. So let's talk about, okay, what is the desktop? What is Lumina's answer to that question of what is the desktop? With other desktops, KDE, GNOME, and derivatives, you tend to see the all-in-one approach. I mentioned this before. You install KDE, you got everything. You install GNOME 3, you got everything. That has lots of dependencies, but then again, the user doesn't really need to install anything either. It's great for more appliance-centric installations where the user might not have access to adding new stuff to it because everything is provided out of box. And then you have other desktops like XFCE, LXQT, Lumina 1.0 that are much more modular and independent from the applications because they just try to stick to the interface. However, these ones still often require several runtime processes. When you launch this desktop, you're not just launching one thing, you're actually launching a host of things. Lumina 2, where this comes down to be a little different, it is the interface only. We do follow that model, similar to Lumina 1, so it's not forcing you to have a whole ton of applications and stuff installed. It's literally just the interface itself. We provide other applications in our tree, but those are not required. They're all technically optional. There are no operating services required for Lumina 2. and we use a modular operating system interaction framework. That cannot be said for most of the other desktops. So for instance, I'll use KDE and GNOME again. KDE and GNOME will not run on the BSDs without particular things running, in particular console kit and dbus. LXQT, I think, has those same two dependencies. I think HAL is a system service dependency of both of those, but it's optional. It will still run without it, but it has diminished functionality.
How's
You wanna
gone
say-
away.
What?
How's gone away.
Did they find
got
that in Rivet?
deprecated a couple years ago.
Oh, I know, but it's still required and still used on the BSDs.
Yeah, on the BSDs
Yes.
it has been. There's been some local patches to keep
Mhm.
it going.
Exactly, I say it's been, yeah.
Yeah.
It's bad. It shouldn't be there. What were you gonna say, Joe?
Oh, just that we're almost out of the dbus requirement. We still require the machine ID because of the QT bug.
Yeah. Well, dbus itself doesn't need to be running. You
No.
just have to make sure a file is there with some
But
kind of
dbus has to
machine ID.
be installed, has to create, that file has to exist.
The file has to exist. You don't need
The
dbus
dbus
actually.
is.
I've
Right, it
actually
can be
talked.
removed.
Yeah, I talked to a lot of like OpenBSD and Dragonfly BSD people.
Yeah.
They run into the exact same limitation. They just have something else that creates that machine ID file. You don't actually need dbus to create it, as long as it's
Nope.
got the same, what is it, like 24 character
Yeah.
length or something like
But
that.
I think, at least for building QT, it's still required.
No. It is an
What?
optional flag in the Qt build settings that you can turn off, and most other operating systems have it disabled
When did they
because
fix
it
that?
causes too many problems. So for instance, on Android, on iOS, on Windows, I think on Mac OS X as well, and maybe some of the Linuxes, they all have disabled dbus in Qt itself.
Yeah, I knew for OS X they did.
Yeah. And that was because they kept trying to say, hey, there are all these problems with it, but a lot of the Linux guys refused to remove dependencies on dbus, so eventually they said, screw it, we're turning dbus off completely. So, where was I? Lumina 2, Qt5, and X11 libraries only. If you look at a lot of the desktops, you will often see not just dependencies on particular libraries, you'll see dependencies on whole hosts of applications and frameworks and services I already mentioned, things like that. They tend to be quite heavy. I mean, even LXQT, which is billed as one of the lightweight desktop alternatives, it still requires 70% of KDE5 in order to run. So, just to give you an idea about that. The other thing, completely independent from applications, is Lumina 2. Again, it's just the interface, it's self-contained, it's independent. It doesn't care what else you have installed on the system, it doesn't care what applications are installed on the system, aside from to give you an easy way to run them. So, if you break it all down to it, a desktop's just a simple task. It has a whole lot of moving little pieces. It gets really, really complicated. But it really shouldn't be that difficult. It really shouldn't be so massive. You can make it a much, much slimmer experience. And that leads right into how is the desktop assembled? What are all these various pieces? Other desktops use a ton of binaries and processes. If you launch a KDE5 session, I believe at last count I saw it was 30 or 40 different processes that it spins up just from starting the KDE session. They often use dbus as their inter-process communication glue. So when you're launching the desktop, you have one master thing launch all the various processes, and then it keeps getting pings from all of them to try and figure out what stage of it is done. How many of them have loaded? Okay, those ones are done. Now I can kick off a few others because we're past the initial init stage. If you actually look into the .desktop files, you'll see lots of special shims for KDE and GNOME for the auto start specifications saying, yeah, this is a desktop application, it needs to start in this particular init phase, which is related to the desktops because they have to start things up sequentially. They're moving much more towards apps as services. I think this falls a lot more under the GNOME umbrella at the moment. They don't really expect applications to be standalone anymore. They are always running and then you just poke them and tell them to wake up. You kind of see that with iOS, you see that with Android already, and GNOME is moving that direction as well, where they use dbus to just wake things up and not necessarily launch it because it should be running most of the time. They often have a highly fragmented core, and they are desktop-dependent extra applications. I'm trying to think of how else to say that. That pretty much says it. They install a whole lot of stuff, but in addition, the applications that work on the desktop generally require the desktop. Those applications that they provide will not work on any other desktops or without like central components of it. So for instance, a lot of the KDE applications like Dolphin will not install and run without having, you know, a good 30 to 40% of the KDE desktop itself also installed and running. So it starts up a lot of the desktop processes whenever you start a KDE application.
Wanting your own terminal and another desktop.
Well, the biggest examples that I see of people wanting to run apps from these other desktops is generally like the Dolphin File Manager, because it does have a very nice interface for NFS and Samba shares and doing FTP directly through the File Manager. It's very nice for that.
Fish for SSH remote file management.
Exactly.
Cool.
There are some things that their applications do very, very well, but they're not designed as standalone applications. And that's basically what I'm coming at.
Yeah, you should try typing Dolphin into a session, like start a Fluxbox and type Dolphin.
Yeah.
See what happens.
And then just watch, have top running in a terminal and just watch all the things spinning up and starting. You have so many KDE init processes launching,
Yeah, all the
launching various
Coca
things.
assists that and Coca
Yeah.
assists that, and it's just like,
Oh, it's yeah, great. So with Lumina 2, it's very different. We have a single binary, and it is a single process, and that's for the entire desktop, not just the window manager, not just for the session, not just for the keyboard shortcuts. It's literally one binary for everything. We use a formalized JSON API for communicating back and forth with Lumina 2. So that from the command line, this can become very scriptable, because you can run Lumina-desktop and then give it a file with some JSON, or we're still working on some of this because Lumina 2 is still in infancy, but the plan is we have a number of flags there, so it's very scriptable to ask the desktop to do things. And we've been using JSON formatting for all of those inputs. Yes?
What would you make it do? With the JSON, what would you make it do?
All sorts of things. If you say, hey, I want to lock my screen at a specified time or whatever, you can send it a signal saying, hey, lock my screen, lock my desktop, and it'll do that. You can tell it, it's like, oh, I want to retile all my windows, or I want to disable a display, or I want to, you know, change screensaver, or you know, something like that. We're trying to, basically, as soon as we add the control into the desktop, I'm trying to add it to the API system as well, so that it's just an option you can give.
Okay.
But by the same token, because it's going through the one binary, that means it also has full knowledge of whether the session is locked at the moment. And it's like, oh, wait a minute, you're not allowed to make changes to that if the session is currently locked.
So you could potentially remote lock a system down the road.
Yes, but no. The desktop binary is a little bit special in that it'll only communicate with your desktop session.
Okay.
So the only way you'd be able to lock that desktop is if you're actually running it as the user logged in.
Well, I was thinking like for more of an enterprise control thing, that would be
Yes.
pretty cool.
So if you were able to,
Yeah.
you were able to log in as root and then, you know, clone your account as one of the other users on the system, you
Yeah.
could run things and tell that desktop to lock or something. Yes, that would be the plan. So in addition to the formalized JSON API, we have the whole concept of applications are transient. When you click it, it starts them up, they run. You close it, they're gone. It terminates the processes, it frees up the memory, it returns the system back to its original state. That's the premise.
how do you send the JSONs? Is it a WebSocket listening?
No, it's a local socket.
Okay. Could you do a WebSocket?
I could, very easily.
Okay.
That's why I have it. That's actually part of my single instance framework, and right now I'm just using a Q local socket, but we could very easily switch that to a Q web socket if we needed to.
I was thinking
Same
in addition to.
Yeah.
Like it would be nice to have like a Lumina CTL command or something
Yep.
to send local JSON, but then it'd be nice if I could connect to it over WebSocket.
It actually uses the Lumina-desktop binary. The same binary that runs the desktop is also the one to talk to the current desktop,
Okay.
because it uses the single instance framework. When you launch it, it says, wait a minute, am I already running on this X display with this user, and then it talks to that process.
Gotcha.
And then in addition, we have a unified core for Lumina 2 and is independent of the extra applications. We don't distribute a whole ton of applications that only run on Lumina. Any of the utilities that are in our source tree, you can compile and run them on KDE. You can compile and run them on Fluxbox. You can compile and run them on, you know, Xmonad or whatever you want. They'll run perfectly fine because they're standalone, independent applications, because that's the idea that we go into it. We want standalone things. And this is just a good quick summary. So most of the desktops look more like the one on the right. They have all the bells and whistles, all the different binaries and processes, and it's often very hard to figure out which one you need to push to do the thing. Whereas what we're trying to do with Lumina 2 is much more like the one on the left. You know it's that one remote. You know you got to hit one button first to change the volume for the simple controls, but then you might have a menu button to get down into the more advanced controls. All right. So how is it different now with regards to desktop and OS interactions? I suppose I should check the time. 6:30. Okay, I'm doing good. By all means, slow me down. We have until 8, right? I think this talk was originally written to be like 45 minutes. Other desktops. Most of the desktops are what I'd say Linux-centric. Not Linux only, but they're developed on Linux, primarily for Linux, and then they are ported to other operating systems. So if you want that desktop like KDE to work on OpenBSD or FreeBSD, you not only have to port the desktop, you have to port all the things the desktop expects to be there, which keeps growing more and more. And right now that's starting to become, like for GNOME, systemd is starting to become a hard dependency, which is going to limit portability of most of these Linux-based desktops. They attempt to control the operating system capabilities. I like to phrase this as the desktop being dominant. So in the war between, or not even the war, in the collaboration between the desktop and the operating system, the desktop is the one that calls the shots on Linux. The desktop says what you can do and what you can't do. The desktop is what defines all your capabilities and whether you can talk to remote network shares and things like that. And then the desktop is required to provide a multitude of utilities for the operating system tasks. If you go and install KDE on any operating system out there right now, some of the things that you will find that are automatically installed are things for controlling or watching, network traffic, network devices, removable devices, I believe I mentioned that earlier with the removable media, and a whole bunch of other things that fall more under controlling the operating system, but it comes with it out of box. On the BSDs, most of those utilities don't work, but they're still there. With Lumina 2, we take a completely OS agnostic approach. Instead, we provide an optional internal mapping for operating system interactions. And what I mean by that is we have a single file for each of the various operating systems called LOS or Lumina OS dash name of operating system. So there's one called LOS dash FreeBSD, and it's basically just a list of static functions saying, oh, in order to do this, this is the command you run. In order to shut down, this is the command you run. In order to, things like that. So it's just a mapping for, oh, this was built for a particular operating system. Here's the set of commands for that operating system to do this, standardized set of interactions. Kind of like providing our own API, but not for everything, just for the desktop. Similarly, it is an interface for the OS capabilities, and I like to say the operating system is dominant in this case. Lumina itself does not try to dictate to the operating system what it should or shouldn't do. Instead, it is much more passive about that and listens for events from the operating system about what the operating system says it can or can't do. A good example of this is our removable media stuff in TrueOS with Lumina. The way that works is in TrueOS, when you plug in a USB drive, the operating system picks up on it through devd events. It creates a .desktop registration file for that device listing all the actions that are capable of it and dumps it in the /media directory. What the desktop does is it just watches that /media directory, and for every single one of those files that appears, the desktop makes it available to the user. It doesn't automatically run any of them. It doesn't decide what should be done with them. It simply says, hey, this is now available, and then it lets the user pick and choose what they want to do with it, if anything. So it's a much more passive approach to what the operating system can do. And then similarly, the desktop is minimal. The OS control utilities are expected to be installed by the operating system, not by the desktop. So Lumina doesn't come with stuff to manage your networking. Lumina doesn't come with stuff to manage removable devices. It just listens for the operating system, and if there are any utilities available, they really should be installed by the operating system and registered appropriately so Lumina knows they're there. And there's a whole set of registrations for applications and stuff to say, oh, this is a settings utility, so it shows up in the control panel, it shows up under system settings. And that's the way we actually do it with TrueOS, with all the utilities that we wrote specifically for controlling FreeBSD. We actually have them all registered on the system, and then they'll show up in the system settings. So it's kind of like this. How many different actions do you have to take to do one thing on your operating system? let's say, again, I've been using the example of removable media at the moment. How many steps do you have to take to get there? With Lumina, it ends up being very simple. Just unplug it and do what the operating system told you. With the other desktops, it's this complicated back and forth. I believe it dials out and runs 4 different processes, at least 5, one way, and then it has to come all the way back and go back and forth a few times with a message before you can actually get full reaction. Because the desktop sends a dbus message to console kit then relays that over to, what is it, Haldi, I believe it is, on the BSDs, I'm trying to think. I think it goes back to Haldi. Haldi then probes and tries to find the device, and then it sends a message back along that entire chain just to say, oh, this is what I found, and then it has to go back and forth to check statuses on them, it has to go back and forth to check names, and it ends up being this whole big complicated mess, kind of like a maze that you get here. With Lumina, much simpler. Just let the operating system do its thing, and it will tell us what it can do and how to run it, and it just makes everything much smoother. So this is kind of my summary of the whole thing with regards to desktops, the way Lumina's going, the way other desktops are going, is that I really see that desktop developers in open source communities really are kind of approaching a crossroads. Do we continue to follow the example of Windows, where the desktop and the operating system are almost completely entangled? You can't really separate them from each other. I mean, OS X is kind of like that to a degree, but they still have a large, very robust, non-graphical server as well, from what I understand, that you can get to. It's not commonly used, but it's kind of there. Or do we start following and start creating and using operating standards for our own desktop and OS interactions? Do we continue to follow the Unix way, if you will? With Lumina, we're trying to forge ahead with portability, simplicity, standardizations. Instead of trying to say the desktop has to do everything, let's just standardize the interactions for the desktop to talk to the operating system, whichever operating system that is. And that's kind of the way we're going forward to it. So again, it's a different methodology, it's a different mindset, but I think that's kind of where we're getting to with a lot of the desktops. And you can see that even among the developers of the developer community of the desktop environments. And I'm not just talking GNOME and KDE. How many other desktop environments have you heard of within the last 2 years that are new, that have gotten started? There's probably 6 or 7 new ones that I've heard about. They're all pretty small. Some of them have very niche targets, like, oh, they're completely HTML5, or they're completely, one thing or another. But there's starting to be a whole lot more people, and mainly, if you dig down into it, it's because they're trying to return back to minimalism, back to simplicity in the desktop itself. And I think that since we've been around a little bit longer than most of those, I think we have a really good shot at helping to direct that and steer that ship. Yes, Joe?
One thing, just on the Windows side of thing, it's becoming not true anymore with Windows Server Core.
Yes.
They've completely separated the...
yeah, exactly. Linux desktops are trying to become more and more entangled.
Right.
Windows, on the other hand, has said, no, this doesn't work. We're trying to split them apart again.
They just basically SysADM.
Exactly. So it's like, and so you can see what a lot of the big desktops are doing and how they're trying to pull them apart and clearly define, oh, this is the operating system, but this is just the interface. And they're trying to make that distinction as well, and having a lot harder trouble because they're so massive and there's so much stuff there.
Oh, certainly, yeah.
So if we're going to write an interface from scratch like we have been with the Lumina project, let's do it right and start out the right way and keep it that way.
Yeah, like I don't know if it's changed at all, but you couldn't install Exchange the last I checked without the full desktop, even though really... I mean, because they still haven't quite gotten there as far as the server core OS being a full-fledged OS, as you mentioned.
Exactly.
So it's a lot harder.
Will you cringe if when I'm explaining SysADM I compare it to the Windows computer management tool?
I will not cringe.
Okay. Because it's no fun to do it then.
Well, they copied the best.
Well, I don't think the timelines quite work out that way, but okay.
All right. And so that's just my talk about Lumina and the way desktops are designed and developed and kind of where we're going and how Lumina is kind of going against the trends of the way current development is going on in open source desktops. I will open the floor for questions. I'll open the
When
ceiling
is
for
Lumina
questions.
2 going to be out?
2 weeks.
You've been saying,
No,
we've been saying 2
no.
weeks for a long time.
You've been saying,
No, he's been saying 2 months.
oh, is it 2 months? I'm sorry.
Lumina 2, I have scheduled for an internal beta at the very beginning of 2018. I'm hoping to get it out and available for internal testing in the first or second week of January. I am hoping to get to a public beta for Lumina 2 by February, maybe beginning of March, depending on, again, how things go with the internal beta and stuff. And then the first official release of Lumina 2 will be with the next stable update for TrueOS, which is June 1st of 2018. And so that's our target.
We can break it good for you.
I know you can.
Well, if you give it to your brother, he'd run it right now, and he'd push it right now.
No, he'd wait for Friday and then push it.
Over the weekend.
Yeah, okay.
He would push it Friday. So
He's
over the weekend.
Yep.
What's wrong with pushing on a Friday?
On a 3-day weekend.
On a 3-day weekend, right?
Yeah.
For Thanksgiving?
Cruel person.
You would.
I've been there.
You would too.
Yeah, push
Before you go on vacation
That's
also?
the best time.
With a message, see you guys Monday.
Right? Okay, thanks, bye.
Yeah. We're going out of town. Goodbye.
I've seen a guy push on the 5 minutes before his last moment in the company. On his way out the door. I thought that was dirty.
Pretty risk-free for him.
Right. Well, that's what happened with the whole FreeNAS Corral thing. Not only did they push it, then the entire team, Jordan, gave the entire week off. So everyone disappeared for a week.
We were trying to answer questions on the forums. We had no idea.
Nobody knew
anything. We were just trying to go to each other and say, "Do you know anything about this? No, do you?"
That's just mean.
Right.
Oh, it was bad.
That's pretty brutal. Was it he went out and flew his plane? So
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, and when I mean vacation, like everyone did unplugged. Like there was nobody around.
They were gone. Oh.
So I'm just saying, I have learned a little bit from my predecessors on trying not to do that.
So,
We did that last year a couple of times on a 3-day
I don't
weekend.
know what you're talking about.
Oh,
That's the past.
shots fired.
Yeah, barely.
Lumina 2 is going to use QML, right?
Yes.
How is that
So,
going to be different?
one of the reasons it has taken so long for Lumina 2 is that we've been doing a lot of prototyping and a lot of technical tests on a lot of various back-end pieces. First thing I obviously had a prototype and test was making sure the single binary system worked, that I could run everything out of a single binary, and that does work.
Is the single binary multi-thread?
Yes.
Okay.
It is highly multi-threaded.
Okay.
It is highly optimized in many, many different ways, and that's one of the reasons it's taken so long, is because in order to go to something like this, like that simple remote, just because it looks simple on the outside, it's much more complicated on the inside. So it's taken a long time to get here doing all this, but one of the other things that stopped us and delayed us for quite a while was we started doing tests with GPU acceleration. When you start doing compositing and other graphical effects for your desktop, you really need to ensure that the GPU is doing most of the graphical effects and graphical rendering. And so I think I tested 4 different systems for actually trying to offload all of the work to the GPU whenever possible. And the one that we finally settled on that works is still using Qt, but it's using the QML scripting language for the interface itself. That is, QML is also what KDE 5 and Plasma 5 use for their interface, but we're doing it differently. We don't do everything in QML because it's highly inefficient. If you don't know much about QML, it's very similar to JavaScript. It's basically Qt's inbuilt version of JavaScript. So it's much, much less optimized, it's much slower at doing stuff because it's a scripting language. It's not as good as C or C++. But
except for graphical things where it's accelerated.
Graphical stuff where it's accelerated is very nice, but the
Yeah.
moment you start doing like random numbers and stuff, it's much slower than anything you can do in the C side.
Overriding a screensaver simplifies.
Oh yeah, simplifies things considerably for writing a screensaver.
Because you showed
But
that was.
one of the other things that we had to prototype and we're still working through right now is we're not only using the QML just for the interface. We're not for the whole desktop, only for the interface. So all the application registrations, all the events about Windows, all the back and forth for the standards and stuff, that's all done with C++ in the back end. And then we're only talking to C++ objects, so all the heavy lifting is done with C++, and then the interface just watches those particular objects, and when something changes, it reflects it on the screen. So we're trying to restrict the scripting language and restrict that just to the graphics, which is where it shines, rather than trying to use it for everything, which is what KDE 5 has done a lot of. They do almost everything in QML from what I've seen.
They're starting to pull that back.
They're starting to dial it back because they realized it doesn't work.
Wasn't that the approach that Unity also took, where everything was QML or?
No,
Unity's based on GTK3.
No,
it's
no,
based on the
no.
GNOME
But
stuff.
the new Unity, the canonical abandoned Unity Next, was in QML.
That wouldn't surprise me. QML
Yes.
QML is a very battle-tested professional system. If you start looking into industries, like for instance car manufacturers,
Yeah.
most of the heads-up displays and cars and stuff are all written in Qt and QML.
I was just wondering if they
So-
took the same, if anyone knew if they took the same approach.
I don't know. I couldn't tell you. But yeah, it's definitely a very robust and very powerful system. The moment you bring up all the QML docs, you see stuff like, whoa, all the stuff I wished I could do with C++, all of a sudden I can do in 3 lines now because I've already done it. So it makes graphical stuff very, very easy.
So
And
would a web developer be very comfortable?
a web
doing
developer
things?
would be very comfortable working on the interface itself,
I think that
especially
would
if
be
I
the
give
thing.
you standardized C objects that you can just use and listen to for events. But yes, QML, because it is their version of JavaScript, it actually has the capability to run JavaScript scripts directly from within it as well. So in addition to your QML script, you can just say, oh, go run this JS file, and it'll do it. So you can do things like that very, very easily. It's not quite as optimized as doing it through QML directly, but you can do it.
Does it need Node?
No. It does not need Node. Like I said, it's Qt's built-in JavaScript. You don't need to install JS, you don't need to install Node or anything. It's compiled into Qt itself.
You mentioned compositing.
Yes.
What can we look forward to in the window manager? Like, are you going to have tiling? And
It is going to be a hybrid window manager with tiling and layering. So you should be able to switch it between one way or another because it's just a flag as to, hey, I always want my windows tiled, or no, I want them tiled some of the time, which means you also have to have layering built in. Layering is the much harder challenge. So getting that right, which I think we've already done from some of the early demos, we just got to redo it within the QML interface. We've already kind of got that working, so the tiling is just saying, oh, well now the user can't move things without actually rearranging the entire interface. So it actually is a lot simpler of a task.
Do you think you'll be able to implement what I wanted with like being able to choose different lock points? So like there are people that emulate on a 4K monitor, being able to have like 4 1080p, but having that screen be able to actually be aware of that. Do you have any clue what I'm talking about?
Not much.
We talked at one point about, like, you know, sometimes on a larger monitor, it's nice to be able to say, some people have programs to say, like, hey, I can actually just treat each sector like it's its own monitor, so I can snap and expand.
Oh yeah,
and
just
do
breaking
all
up the
that.
monitor
Yeah.
into individual subsections.
Yeah, and do.
Yeah. We should be able to do that.
are you planning on having a plug-in system for this window manager? I'm thinking of like the Compiz config settings manager, because you get
Yes.
like all these fancy things you can turn on or off, but you just add it by a plugin.
If you're familiar with the Lumina 1 branch, I am very plugin friendly. I like using standardized plugin mechanisms so that the user can make the interface as lightweight or as heavy or fancy as they want. I'm not one of those people that likes to go through, turn on all the bling and say, hey, now you have to use it. I like making sure that when I add things like graphical effects and animations that they're always behind toggles so that the user can say, I don't want fade effects, I don't want this, and you can either turn them off or turn them up or, you know, do things like that. So I like configurability, because, yes.
So when you do Lumina 2, will you still have the option to switch window managers and so on?
No. You will not be able to run the window manager. Let's see, now that's actually one of the things in the extended window manager hints is the ability to run your window manager with the special --switch-wm command, and that will basically rip out and disable the window manager that's currently running and replace it with the current window manager.
Okay.
Lumina 2 will not support that. The window manager is no longer a separate thing. It is tied in directly to the desktop, directly to the screensaver,
Right.
directly to the screen locker. So ripping it out
Which will mean
to
the same
replace
thing
it
for
will
compositing,
not be
right?
supported.
Compositing all integrated.
All of it. It's all integrated within a single binary. So normally, I mean, even with Lumina 1, the way we're doing it is when you launch the desktop, you have one desktop process, one window manager process, one screensaver process, and one compositing process. So that's still 4 processes. It's a ton lower than most of the other desktops, but it's still a bunch of different processes. And it introduces security holes where, okay, well, what if somebody were to just, cause a seg fault in the screen locker, for instance? Well, now they've gained graphical access to your system if they happen to be sitting at your desk. With Lumina 2, by having it all within a single binary, if there is some kind of exploit like that where they can cause a buffer overflow and crash the utility or whatever, it'll close down the entire session and all your applications, not just the screen locker. This is a problem that has been known in the desktop developer communities for a long, long time. The solution for it from the KDE guys and the GNOME guys is, well, you just need to use Wayland. They don't actually fix the problem with multiple processes running. They somehow just think that Wayland solves it. That's the quoted answer that I saw from one of the KDE guys. Yes?
Are you going to support Wayland on there? you kind of brought that up on yourself right there.
Yes, with all the X11 stuff within Lumina 2 is highly compartmentalized to just a couple files so that we can migrate it and use it on Wayland as well. So instead of having to rewrite all of the desktop or all the interactions, we've done all the standardization on the back end for standard structures and stuff, so we only need to update a couple files in order to change the X11 calls to Wayland calls.
We need to start testing that in TrueOS, because Wayland, of course, relies upon having valid GPU acceleration and so forth.
Are you still doing much of the window manager in just relying on the native Qt window management? That's what was the original plan like months ago?
No, we moved away from that. That was one of the early tech demos, and we moved away from that pretty quickly. Okay. Because the native Qt window management system, the QMDI windows, it's way too limited and it does way too many wrong things.
Okay.
It might be work for like an application within a desktop where it's expecting the desktop to do everything, but most of the MDI stuff, it dials out and says, hey, I need you to do this, but if nothing else is there, it doesn't do anything.
Okay.
So.
What kind of memory footprint since you've written this from the ground up?
Okay, with KDE and GNOME, I believe you've seen those generally require closer to 400 to 500 megs of memory to run, sometimes more, depends on how much you have enabled out of box. Lumina 1, which is the current release version of Lumina, runs at around 70 to 90 megs of memory, and that's everything static system once you get booted up. On TrueOS with ZFS and all the other system tray applications running out of box, we generally hover at around 200 megabytes of used memory just logging into the desktop and everything running. That was set to run by default.
Yeah, you could lower your arc size down too.
And you can lower things, and that's without any special tuning or turning off applications or your auto start applications and stuff.
That's the reason for running it right there.
Yeah.
Did you say what have you gotten out of Lumina 2?
I haven't started doing benchmarks on Lumina 2 yet, but some of the early during the tech, I haven't done any benchmarks since I started doing the QML stuff.
Yeah.
But the QML stuff doesn't really add anything to the binary and the memory overhead as much as the CPU cycles and stuff, but that gets offloaded to the GPU. So most of that is kind of offset by the GPU acceleration. But before I had started doing the QML stuff, I was still running pretty close to the same as Lumina 1 with regards to memory for maybe just a tiny bit heavier, because it's not only doing the desktop, it was also doing the window manager and the screensaver and all the other stuff too. And I think I was running it a little bit closer to 100 megs instead of 70 megs.
If you run JavaScript, might need 2 gigs. Right? We run it all within Chrome.
Oh, yeah.
But you're already running Chrome, so that's okay, right?
Yeah, right? You already have an
That way
instance
it's
of it. We start one on boot right after the kernel loads.
Who was it the other day that said Chrome was more lines of code than FreeBSD?
Yeah,
Yeah,
the
it's true.
Chromium project is like
Who
2
was
times
that?
the lines of code of the FreeBSD project itself.
Well, I mean, the thing about the FreeBSD project is what, 30% of it CFS? 40%?
Yeah, there's a huge chunk.
Yeah, so even,
Yeah, your web browser is heavier than your file system and your operating system.
There literally is a complete operating system.
I mean, it still has all
has
those.
its own network
Yeah,
manager.
I mean,
has, even in Chromium, has all that code for that.
What was that European project that was ripping all that code
So
out
I
of
built
Chrome?
the whole OS itself.
Iridium.
Iridium.
Yeah, it's already available.
Web
It's
browser is another 70.
Chromium, but with a lot of stuff turned off or ripped out and disabled. So
Only for privacy, not
More than
for
just- yeah.
not for heaviness, but just for privacy.
Just
They
for
rip
privacy,
out-
yeah.
They rip out all the dial home stuff to Google.
So,
Yeah.
kind of random, but some people they may be interested. Has anybody here heard of Fuchsia? The new operating system that Google's working on, that's kind of people going, okay, is this going to be an Android replacement? At least underlying level for Linux. Is this going to be underlying replacement for Chrome OS, for embedded devices, whatever? There was one of the developers was at the OpenZFS conference looking at what file system they're going to be using. Because it will all be probably Apache licensed versus GPL.
Well, that was actually one of the things that was really interesting when I talked in Ohio as well, because when I was giving this talk, I went into a segue about licensing and what Linux was, if I remember right. Do you remember this, JT?
Yes, I do.
Okay. It's like, what is a Linux operating system? Well, Linux isn't an operating system. It's just a kernel. It doesn't actually run anything. It doesn't have the bits needed. What you generally consider as your Linux operating system is your Linux kernel plus one of these GNU desktops or plus some other stuff to make it work. That's why you actually see the way that Linux is developing that's why you see the development of systemd. That's why you see the development of all of these back-end toolkits for the Linux-based desktops, because they're basically just trying to fill the void of that there is no standardized Linux operating system, so the desktops are trying to provide the standards. They're trying to provide all the stuff and say, oh, we've only got a kernel, so we need to talk to that. We don't have a full operating system to talk to. So it's like, systemd will never run on the BSDs. I understand that. I'm just really sad that the desktops the Linux-based desktops seem to expect it now, because there is a better way of looking for your dependencies.
But it was really interesting listening to, was this on BSD now when you were there? I'm trying to remember, either which desktop said that they were testing on our platform, GNOME or KDE, or one of them, said they were testing more on FreeBSD, and the guy said that no, it's not that we want systemd for what systemd is. We want systemd because it's a standard interface. We don't care if you shim it on the back end, but we just need a standard interface to work against.
And that ties to what I said earlier. The desktops are really looking for some kind of standardized operating system interface, period. And systemd is their way of enforcing it and pushing it. Other questions? Thoughts? Snide remarks?
I have a silly question.
Sure.
The picture you had with the chain lock with the maze,
Yeah.
is that, I mean, it's an awesome metaphor, but I look at that and I'm thinking, is that somebody who wants to keep the kids in?
That's like the horror movie cliche where you can't ever,
Yeah.
do it.
I don't think there's actually an exit for the
There
chain.
there is. It's in the
There
bottom
is.
left.
There is, yeah, I found it. Yeah.
Bottom left, maybe?
Yeah, bottom left.
Bottom left is
Oh,
the
you
get
get
to
there. Okay, it's one of those ones you pull out, not go off the side.
Yeah.
So.
After I started thinking about it, and my mind wandered a little bit. I thought that could be a little creepy, depending on what you're.
Yeah, just don't
Who
ever
wants
go
the
over to
kids?
Ken's house and let
You want to come see my house?
If it's dark when you're trying to do that, it's a much bigger challenge.
Oh yes.
Well, do you guys mind if we all introduce ourselves, since I know I don't know a lot of the folks here, just kind of, name and where you work, what you do,
Name, rank, and serial number?
Yes, name, rank, serial number, DNA sample on the way out.
Just make name, address.
All right,
Social security number.
You mean you don't have that already?
Well, I'll go first since I'm the one that's up here anyway. I'm Ken Moore. I work here at IX Systems. I'm the founder of the Lumina desktop and one of the core developers for TrueOS.